They told her to take it off. Just a 2-inch flag pin, silent, harmless, loyal. But in that moment, it wasn't fabric and metal. It was defiance. In less than a minute, the woman who had once stood beside presidents found herself standing outside a federal courthouse like a stranger at her own trial. No jury, no gavel, just a laminated sign declaring that patriotism was now problematic. And yet, she didn't flinch. She reached in her bag, clicked record, and unknowingly lit the fuse to a firestorm that would shake the pillars of American justice. What happened next wasn't just a viral clip. It became a mirror, forcing the nation to look at what it had become and what it was willing to silence. This is not the story of a courtroom. This is the story of a system, tested, torn, and transformed by one woman who refused to take off pin. You're watching Black Footprints, where every untold story leaves a mark. If this moment hits you like it hit the country, don't forget to subscribe because this isn't just history. It's happening. It began like any other morning in D.C., gray skies, coffee steam rising from street carts, the city humming with quiet purpose. But on the courthouse steps, something else stirred. Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, stood tall in her navy blazer, her posture composed but electric. Her eyes were focused, sharp with intention. Pinned to her lapel was a 2-inch American flag, gleaming quietly in the early light. This wasn't her first time walking into a courtroom. She had entered dozens, sometimes as a rising star, sometimes as a veteran defender of the Constitution. But today felt different, heavier. She wasn't just arguing a case. She was standing for a principle, a deeply personal one. Today's hearing concerned religious expression in public schools. Territory Pam had spent years fighting to protect. But she never imagined the real battle would begin before she even crossed the threshold. At the security checkpoint, a young guard, badge polished, voice rehearsed, raised his hand. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remove that pin," he said, pointing to her chest. His tone was flat, his words firm. Pam blinked, not in confusion but disbelief. "Excuse me, there's a new policy," he replied, gesturing toward a laminated sheet posted behind him. "No political symbols allowed inside. That includes flags, religious icons, campaign slogans. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." She followed his finger to the sign. Sure enough, there it was, typed in bureaucratic blandness. All visual symbols deemed political are prohibited for courtroom neutrality. And in parentheses, includes U.S. flag lapel pins. The breath caught in her throat, not because she was angry yet, but because something sacred had just been quietly labeled dangerous. Behind her, an elderly man in a faded army cap shifted uncomfortably. A woman with a toddler on her hip leaned in, whispering something. The air changed. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged. Pam looked down at her pin. The stars, the stripes, the quiet testament to service, sacrifice, unity. She had worn it for years. In court, on TV, at funerals for veterans. No one had ever questioned it. Until now. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply reached in her bag, pulled out her phone, and hit record. "This is Pam Bondi," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I've just been denied entry to a federal courthouse because I'm wearing a U.S. flag pin. No eslogans. No party. Just the flag." A gasp rippled through the small crowd behind her. Someone else raised a phone. The Army vet raised his hand to his brow in a silent salute. The child clutched his mother's hand tighter. In less than 60 seconds, the moment was captured. One woman, standing still, yet refusing to back down. No teatrix. No anger. Just a quiet confrontation between the ideals of neutrality and the reality of identity. She didn't know, as she walked away from the entrance, that her 30-second video would ignite a national debate. That by nightfall, it would top 6 million views. That cable news anchors would quote her words. That veterans groups, civil liberty advocates, and ordinary citizens from Kansas to California would rally behind a pin, a symbol they'd worn for decades, now suddenly deemed controversial. She didn't know it yet, but the courthouse door that had closed on her wasn't the end. It was the match. Because that day, when they tried to take away her right to wear a flag, they didn't just challenge her. They challenged something far deeper: the American right to believe, to speak, and yes, to love this country openly. And that fight had only just begun. By the time the clock struck noon, the video had caught fire. 6 million views, 50,000 shares, trending across every major platform. But it wasn't just numbers, it was emotion. A swell, a pulse that had traveled through the quiet hearts of people who had long felt something slipping away and didn't know what it was until now. Pam Bondi's face filled phone screens across the country. Not yelling, not crying, just standing, shoulders squared, a flag pin on her chest, and a phone in her hand. Her voice steady, her words simple. No slogans, no party, just a flag. And somehow, that was enough to break the silence. By 2 p.m., veterans began showing up at the courthouse, first in 2s and 3s, then in busloads. Some in faded fatigues, others in polished uniforms they hadn't worn in years. Their medals clinked gently in the breeze, their eyes hard with quiet fury. A teacher from Baltimore stood on the sidewalk holding a handmade sign. If the flag offends you, it's not the flag that's the problem. Law students from Georgetown arrived next, fresh-faced, idealistic, clutching pocket constitutions and cold coffee. "I skipped class," one whispered. "This is class." By sundown, the crowd had grown into the hundreds. Flags waved in every direction. American ones, yes, but also hand-painted banners that read things like "Let Pam in," "Let freedom in," and "Silence is not neutrality." Then came the moment no one expected. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, stepped up to the makeshift podium, just a milk crate and a megaphone handed from stranger to stranger. She wore jeans, a hoodie, and a small flag pin too big for a collar. Her voice was thin, but it carried. "My daddy," she said, "died in Afghanistan, with this flag on his shoulder." She looked up, tears shimmering but unshed. And now they're saying this lady can't even wear it to court? That's not right. The crowd went silent, a pause heavy enough to bow heads. Then the applause came, slow, strong, rising like thunder. Pam watched it all from behind her living room window. She wasn't at the courthouse anymore. The press had started camping on her lawn. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. But for now, she needed space. Stillness. Until her doorbell rang. She opened it to find a small envelope tucked beneath a bouquet of grocery store flowers. No sender. No fanfare. Just one folded page, handwritten in looping script. It read, "I'm a nurse. I've worn scrubs through 3 pandemics, 2 shifts a day, no time to think about politics. But today, I pinned a flag to my uniform. Not for a party, but because you didn't take yours off. Thank you, Laura." Pam's throat tightened. She read it again, and again, because that's what this was really about. Not just a courtroom rule, not just a pin, but what it meant when one woman said no more, and 1,000 voices answered, "Me too." What had started as a solitary moment at a metal detector was now something else entirely, a rising. No rallies had been planned. No hashtags had been strategized. But people came anyway. Parents, veterans, nurses, students, all of them holding small pieces of a story they suddenly felt part of. Not because Pam asked them to, but because deep down they knew if a flag can be silenced, so can they. And not today. Not this time. It came in the dead of night. Not a knock. Not a call. Just a vibration on her phone. 3 buzzes. No name. Just the letter W. Pam sat at her kitchen table, the only light coming from a single lamp and the faint glow of her laptop. The crowd outside her house had thinned, but her mind hadn't. The flag pin was still on her blazer, draped carefully over the back of a chair. She hadn't taken it off, not even asleep. She couldn't. She opened the message. 1 line of text. "You need to see this." Attached was a single document, a scanned internal court memo, marked confidential. It bore the header of the Federal Judiciary Administration. The title sent a chill down her spine. "Protocol for Visual Neutrality Enforcement. Effective immediately." Signed, Judge Edward Grayson. Pam froze. Judge Grayson. It wasn't just that he was the presiding judge of the federal district court. It was who he had been to her. Years ago, when she was a fresh-faced law student full of fire and idealism, Edward Grayson had been her mentor. He was sharp, principled, fiercely academic. He quoted the Constitution like poetry and spoke of justice like it was sacred. She admired him once, trusted him, but something had changed. Over the years, he'd grown colder, more rigid. He'd begun to treat order as something to be enforced, not nurtured. Pam had seen the shift during a case nearly a decade ago. She'd submitted a folder of evidence in a civil rights hearing, meticulously prepared, sourced, and presented. But it had one thing on the cover, the national motto, "In God We Trust." Grayson had tossed it aside. "This courtroom doesn't endorse faith," he'd snapped. Even in ink. Pam hadn't forgotten. She never spoke about it. Until now. She scrolled through the memo, each paragraph heavier than the last. Flag-adjacent symbolism deemed likely to incite partisan identification. Crucifixes, religious jewelry, political color combinations, and nationalistic pins included under discretionary review. Designed to ensure visual neutrality and avoid ideological disruption in proceedings. And there it was, in black ink beneath the protocol, prepared and endorsed by Chief Judge Edward Grayson. Her stomach turned. So this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an overzealous guard or a one-off misstep. It was a strategy, a system, a suppression cloaked in neutrality. And it had a name. Pam leaned back in her chair, mind racing. This man, her former mentor, hadn't just written the rule that blocked her entry. He had architected an entire policy to scrub courtrooms of meaning, of identity, of history. And he did it from behind the safety of silence, counting on no one to push back. Until now, her hands trembled slightly as she printed the memo and slid it into a leather folder. She didn't need coffee. She didn't need sleep. What she needed was daylight and a camera. Because tomorrow, she wasn't just going to fight for a flag. She was going to confront a system that called patriotism partisan, faith disruption, and silence neutral. And the man at the center of it all? He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a symbol of everything she once believed in, and everything she now had to stand against. The hearing chamber was packed before sunrise. Cameras crowded the back wall. Journalists scribbled frantically into notepads. A line of citizens wrapped around the marble columns of the Capitol building, braving the chill of early morning air just for a glimpse, just to say they were there when it happened. Inside, a single name card waited at the witness table, Pamela Bondi. She walked into the chamber with the same quiet resolve she had shown on that courthouse step. No entourage, no dramatic entrance, just her a leather folder under one arm, and that flag pin still resting proudly over her heart. Senator Joseph Carver, chairman of the Judiciary Oversight Committee, adjusted his glasses and leaned toward the mic. "Ms. Bondi, the nation is watching." "I'm aware," Pam said softly. "And so is the Constitution." She placed the folder on the table and opened it with deliberate care. Inside, printed in bold letters, was the memo, the one bearing Judge Grayson's name, the one that started it all. "This isn't speculation," she began. "This isn't rumor. This is policy, crafted, signed, and implemented less than 24 hours before I was denied access to a public courtroom for wearing the American flag." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Then she flipped to the next page. "This," she said, holding up a photo, "is Karen Delaney. Her son, Corporal Evan Delaney, died in Afghanistan. She wears his photo in a locket, always. But 2 weeks ago, she was told to remove it before entering a county courtroom. The locket was labeled, quote, an emotional distraction." Gasps rippled through the room. She turned the page again. "This," she continued, "is Emily Tran. She's a military lawyer, decorated, respected, and 29 years old. She was denied entry to a federal court last month for wearing a hair clip in the shape of an eagle. The reason? It was deemed a militaristic symbol." A hush fell over the chamber. No one moved. Pam looked up. Her voice was calm, but sharpened to a fine edge. "How do we get here?" she asked. "When did a flag, a photo, a hair clip become threats to justice? When did the courtroom, the one place meant to amplify truth, become so fragile it had a silence, meaning to survive. Senator Carver shifted in his chair. His eyes had grown glassy. What I experienced wasn't just about a pin, Pam continued. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness, one that hides behind the word neutrality, while systematically scrubbing courtrooms clean of expression, heritage, and sacrifice. She leaned forward, voice low and steady. Neutrality is not the absence of identity. It is the fair treatment of all identities. A beat passed, then another. No one interrupted. And in that silence, something shifted. Pam reached for the last page in the folder. A draft proposal titled the Citizen Fair Access Act, a federal guideline to protect expressive symbols of national unity in courtrooms, so long as they do not disrupt proceedings or target others. This is our chance, she said, to make sure the system we've entrusted with justice does not become the very thing that erodes it. Senator Carver looked down at the proposal, then back at her. We will review it, he said, his voice tight with emotion. Carefully, thoroughly, and transparently. But everyone in the room already knew. This wasn't just a policy review. It was a national reckoning, because what had started as a flag pin was now a mirror held up to the face of American justice. And it was time to see what stared back. The chamber was electric. Judge Edward Grayson entered through a side door flanked by two aides, his steps deliberate, his expression unreadable. The once imposing figure who had ruled courtrooms with a steely gaze now looked slightly smaller beneath the fluorescent lights of public scrutiny. Cameras tracked his every move. The gallery was packed. Lawyers, veterans, teachers, students, all of them waiting. Watching. Senator Joseph Carver opened the proceedings. Judge Grayson, he said, his tone measured but hard. You're here today to answer not just for your policy, but for what that policy represents. Grayson leaned forward, calm but distant. My intent, he began, was never to discriminate. It was to preserve the sanctity of the courtroom in an increasingly volatile climate. He cleared his throat, rehearsed. Neutrality is essential. Visual triggers, regardless of their origin, risk tainting the perception of justice. It's not about the flag. It's about decorum. Pam sat quietly in the gallery, arms crossed, jaw set. She had heard this tone before, the polished arrogance of someone who mistook silence for superiority. But today, silence would not save him. Across the room, Senator Daniel Brooks, a voice rarely heard in such hearings, tapped his microphone and spoke. I'd like to enter new evidence into the record, he said. He held up a single sheet of paper, an internal email dated 6 weeks prior to Ms. Bondi's courthouse incident, sourced from Judge Grayson's own chambers. The room shifted. The audience leaned forward. In this email, Brooks continued, Judge Grayson refers to conservative female attorneys as, and I quote, rhetorical landmines wearing lipstick and patriotism. Gasps exploded through the gallery. Grayson's face went pale. That was taken out of context, he stammered. It was private correspondence, not policy. You were talking about federal officers, Brooks snapped. Women who swore the same oath you did. And you didn't just mock them. You dismissed everything they stood for. Grayson sat back, stunned silent. And then Pam stood. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need it. Mr. Chairman, she said, voice clear and cutting through the stunned silence. May I respond? Carver nodded, lips pressed in a line. Pam turned to face the man who had once mentored her in a dusty law school lecture hall, who once told her that the law was a living promise. Oh, I've been called worse, she began, fire under every syllable. But this isn't about what he called me. She looked directly at Grayson. It's about what the system let you do. Out in the open. Without challenge. Without shame. Her voice tightened, but did not waver. When you labeled that pin as partisan, you didn't just insult me. You insulted every teacher who pins that flag above their blackboard. Every soldier who's carried it on their shoulder into battle. Every immigrant who's placed their hand over their heart and sworn an oath beneath it. She paused. The room was still. You didn't strip a symbol of bias. You tried to strip it of meaning. And with that, the room erupted. Applause thundered across the chamber. Reporters fumbled with phones, capturing every word. A Vietnam veteran in the second row stood and saluted. Even Senator Carver had to raise his gavel twice before the room calmed. But the damage was done for Grayson and for the system that had shielded him for so long. This was no longer about one woman and a pen. It was about a nation deciding whether its justice system still had a soul. The silence in the hearing room was almost reverent, heavy, electric, and waiting. Judge Edward Grayson sat motionless at the witness table, shoulders slightly slumped, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had seemed when he walked in that morning. His robe was gone, just a plain gray suit now, as if even the title of Your Honor had become too heavy to wear. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice low and rough with something dangerously close to regret, he began. I came here today prepared to defend a policy, he said, but I leave knowing I need to defend something much harder, my own conscience. A ripple ran through the chamber. I thought, Grayson continued, that neutrality was the highest virtue a courtroom could pursue. I believed stripping away expression would protect justice. But in doing so, I didn't create fairness. I created fear. Silence. Erasure. He looked down at his hands, fingers clasped tight. And it took Pam Bondi's refusal to bend for me to see that. Pam sat quietly in the gallery, hands in her lap. She didn't move, didn't smile. This wasn't a victory parade. This was something deeper. A reckoning. Grayson took a breath. His voice steadied. I mocked her, and others like her, behind closed doors where I thought no one was listening. But the truth is, I stopped listening to myself a long time ago. To what justice is supposed to be, not sterile, not stripped of identity, but principled, inclusive, and human. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his judicial pen. He sat on the desk in front of him with a quiet clink that echoed like a gavel. I hereby resign, effective immediately, he said, and I formally request that my courtrooms be the first to undergo independent ethical review under the Citizen Fair Access Act. A collective inhale filled the chamber. The words struck like thunder, not out of scandal, but out of the rarest currency in politics and justice alike, humility. Reporters stopped typing. Aides looked at one another in disbelief. And Pam? She simply nodded. A gesture not of triumph, but of acknowledgement, of grace. Because what had just happened wasn't the fall of a man. It was the release of one. A release from the armor of ego, the performance of power, the illusion of infallibility. And in his surrender, Grayson did something extraordinary. He became the first piece of the system willing to be rebuilt from within. Senator Carver's voice finally broke the silence. This hearing is adjourned, he said softly, but the work has only begun. As people filed out, no one spoke above a whisper. It felt wrong to do so, like raising your voice inside a church. Even the protesters outside had gone quiet, some in tears, others embracing strangers they'd never met. Later, as dusk settled over D.C., someone would post a photo of Grayson's empty chair beside the pen he'd left behind. The caption would read, "Not the end of power, the beginning of accountability." And that would be the legacy of this moment. Not that one man broke, but that one man finally bent, and in doing so, reminded a nation that the law doesn't lose its strength when it shows its soul. 3 months later, the air around the courthouse felt different. Gone was the old metal sign by the entrance that once warned against unauthorized symbols. In its place now stood a polished bronze plaque, carefully mounted just beside the door. The engraving was simple, powerful. Justice isn't fragile. It doesn't fear the flag. The building looked the same from the outside. Same stone pillars, same steps worn smooth by decades of feet. But inside, something had shifted, not in marble or policy, but in tone, in presence, in soul. Court staff now wore flag pins without hesitation. Some tiny and subtle, others bold and bright. One clerk wore her father's purple heart beneath her blazer, another a cross etched into his tie clip. And no one told him to take it off. Pam Bondi hadn't returned to that building since the hearing. But her presence lingered like the echo of a hard-won truth. Instead of occupying courtrooms, she now led from a different seat, chairwoman of the National Commission on Judicial Ethics and Public Access, a newly formed body with real teeth, real oversight, and a real mission. Her first order of business wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a victory tour. It was the quiet implementation of ethical audits in federal courts across the country, beginning with the same district where she was once turned away. But for Pam, title had never meant as much as impact. Every Tuesday evening, without fail, she returned to Georgetown Law, not as a name on a headline, but as Professor Bondi. In a modest classroom lined with eager students, she taught a course titled Justice and Symbolism, where law meets identity. No cameras, no microphones, just a woman, a room full of minds, and the stories that made her who she was. That Tuesday, the classroom buzzed with nervous energy. It was the final week of the semester. Students shuffled their notes, whispered final thoughts, and passed around end-of-class thank yous. Pam stood at the front, calm, reflective. "I don't teach this class," she said. "You do. Every time you ask a question that makes someone uncomfortable, every time you say, 'But what if it means more than that?' That's the law. That's courage." As the bell rang and chairs began to scrape back, a freshman, quiet all term, approached Pam with a small envelope in hand. "I was at the protest," he said, eyes down. "But I didn't say anything. I just watched. I was scared I'd say the wrong thing." But he handed her a photo. It was of Pam, standing alone at the courthouse gates, flag pin catching the light, back straight against the tide of silence. On the back of the photo, he'd written, "I didn't speak up that day, but because of you I now know. Justice doesn't always need a shout. It just needs someone who refuses to stay quiet." Pam blinked slowly, clutching the photo like a relic. Not of pain, but of purpose. As the students filed out and the sun dipped behind the city skyline, she stayed behind. Alone, quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but full of all that had changed. She slipped the photo into her leather briefcase, right beside her original courtroom badge and a tiny flag pin, now a little scratched but still gleaming. Symbols, yes. But now, finally, they meant something again. Not because the system had made space for them, but because someone had stood when it tried to erase them. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles only after the storm has passed. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. The hallway lights were dim. The city outside had long gone to sleep. But in her study, Pam Bondi sat alone, barefoot, hair pulled back, a soft cardigan draped over her shoulders, staring at the glow of her laptop. The cursor blinked at the top of a blank page. She took a breath and typed, "National Code of Judicial Accountability, Draft 1. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a headline. It was a blueprint, one born not from outrage, but from reflection, from experience, from every courtroom where meaning had been mistaken for menace, and every citizen who had been told that their identity was a distraction to justice." She paused. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Then she wrote the mission statement. To protect fairness not only in law, but in tone, treatment, and access to justice for every citizen, regardless of age, gender, political view, or choice to wear a flag. It was simple, but it was revolutionary. Pam leaned back at her chair, the tension in her shoulders slowly unwinding. She glanced toward the far wall, where a tall glass case held the moments that shaped her. Inside were only a few things: her first law license, a faded campaign photo with her father in uniform, the note from the nurse who said, "I wear the flag because you didn't take it off." And now, she had something else to add. From a folder on her desk, she pulled out a worn sheet of paper, the official violation slip from that courthouse morning. At the top, fine, $500, unauthorized symbol, flag lapel pin. No one ever forced her to pay it. After the public outcry, the court quietly voided the citation. They told her it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, but she paid it anyway, in full, the very next day. Not out of guilt, not out of submission. She paid because some rules are worth breaking, and some prices are worth owning. She slid the citation into the glass case, right beside the note and the pin. Closed the door gently. The reflection of the flag shimmered faintly in the glass. Then she whispered to herself, more reminder than declaration, Not because of the money, but because of the principle. That single decision, that quiet act of defiance, had become the hinge of something far greater, a national shift, a realignment of values, a rewriting of what neutrality truly means, not the erasure of difference, but the respectful coexistence of expression. As Pam turned off the lamp and made her way to bed, she passed the window overlooking the Capitol dome in the distance. The same dome she had once walked toward with nothing but a folder in her hand and a storm in her heart. Now, she wasn't chasing justice anymore. She was building it. From within. No fireworks. No speeches. Just a woman, a laptop, and a new draft of hope. And somewhere, far beyond the headlines, beyond the viral clips and courtroom drama, a new foundation had quietly been laid. Not in marble, but in meaning. And it all began with a pin. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's a pin you refuse to take off. And the silence of one person, when chosen at the right moment, can be loud enough to make an entire system listen.